Hello and welcome to OCN NI Internal Verification Sampling Training. As you will be well aware, internal verification is the central quality assurance process performed by your centre. Internal verification ensures that the quality of assessment is consistent and that quality gains and enhancements are continually made as a part of a cycle of progression. Now within that, your sampling of portfolios is of vital importance. If portfolios are not sampled in a proper manner, effectively, in a structured approach, then the whole internal verification system could fail. So today we're going to consider our sampling strategy, how we sample portfolios, what we should consider when making samples, and what should be included in that. Now, it's my hope that those listening to this presentation today have attended the appropriate training course at OCNI already. There will be some understanding and awareness of what we're dealing with in terms of the context of internal verification. As a centre, you should also have a policy which will define what internal verification is and what you do as a centre. I'd also refer you to the OCNI Centre Handbook, which gives some excellent detail on this issue and can support this presentation further. I certainly would encourage you, if you've not read through that yet and read the relevant section on that, to do so. So today we're going to look at what is sampling, what is a sampling strategy, what are you required to do as a minimum process within your centre to successfully sample and therefore have a successful internal verification process. So what is a sampling strategy? Well, a sampling strategy is the procedure for sampling the assessment materials, as mentioned already. It should be appropriate to the context of delivery. It must address variable factors, and essentially it must address identified risks. Your sampling strategy must be sufficient to ensure the consistency of the assessment decisions across each qualification. So this is what internal verification seeks to achieve. Your sampling strategy must be coherent and functional for internal verification to be successful and to achieve what it's set out to do. So it is how your sampling procedure, your sampling strategy is how you will sample assessment materials for moderation. Now, as far as the procedures go, it's essential that we have a written document to define what those procedures are. We're going to look in more detail in a short time as to what procedures we need to have in place, what issues should be addressed. But a fundamental point to start with is the need for them to be written. Many centres operate on an ad hoc basis for sampling, which can mean that in a centre with numerous assessors, different procedures could be implemented, and therefore there'll be an inconsistency in the overall internal verification process. This is not acceptable. We want a consistent approach to sampling within a centre. So to ensure that, written procedures are needed. So a sampling strategy should be a documented procedure, therefore to guarantee consistency across IV activity. It'll also ensure there's a transparency in the process of sampling, therefore we can stand over the effectiveness of the process in addressing risk. So in documenting your internal verification sampling process, we can have that as a standalone document, a sampling strategy. This is quite appropriate, and if your centre has this or you intend to go down this line, that's fine. Your sampling strategy could also be documented within the internal verification plan for a particular course or qualification. So alongside your definition or your description of how internal verification will take place, therefore in terms of the timescale applied to IVing a course and who's going to be responsible for that, etc. A strategy statement alongside that defining how you are going to sample. So our sampling procedures, our sampling strategy fits within a wider context of internal verification requirements. So we should have in place an internal verification plan. If you do not, you need to address this as a priority. courses being delivered and qualifications require an internal verification plan in place prior to their implementation. So we need to have that done. So sampling of portfolios then is what takes place on completion of assessment as the initial phase of internal verification. You will be sampling portfolios which would obviously be reviewed, and the output of internal verification is a sample record report which indicates who has been sampled, details them with some content, and then a feedback to assessor report highlighting action points, highlighting positive and negative aspects of assessment, all designed to enable gains in quality in assessment to enhance the performance of the assessor. And also these documents need to be in place in order for transparency, to feed into wider processes and for monitoring of the overall process. So what is the rationale of sampling? Well, sampling should take into account the variable factors that can affect quality. Sampling should ensure, overall, it should ensure the capacity to support a judgment about the consistency of assessment decisions across all units within a course or a qualification. So our sampling needs to be a comprehensive process. It needs to result in us being able to give a value judgment about what's taken place within assessment. If it cannot do that, then it will undermine the overall internal verification process. So sampling is of central and prime importance in what is the central quality assurance process running within your centre. Now, when considering what our sampling procedure or sampling strategy requires, we're going to look at two general categorizations: a risk-based approach and a structured approach. Now, the risk-based approach is designed to take into account specific risks to quality identified as affecting course delivery. Internal verification is about addressing risk. It's one way of viewing it. We're looking to enhance quality. We need to address risk. So in designing or constructing a sampling procedure and its implementation, we need to be addressing identified risks. These will include the size of the cohort. They will include the inclusion of borderline portfolios, the application of any reasonable adjustments or special considerations, the experience of your assessor and the prior delivery of your assessor, and any previously identified issues that have been highlighted by internal verification or by an external verification report. Now, a structured approach is the way in which we want your sampling strategy to address structural features of delivery, which may present risk in themselves. These may include the use of multiple delivery sites, the use of multiple assessors within assessment, or multiple methods of delivery. These may bring up variations in quality within your assessment. Therefore, they should be addressed specifically, targeted specifically by your strategy. Different methods of assessment. The length of the course. If the course is particularly long, it has numerous units within it, there may be a need for multiple IV samples taken in a structured manner throughout the course rather than one summative endpoint sample. And your sampling strategy should allow flexibility for your internal verifier to select further evidence if required. Therefore, it should be a minimum framework to allow further material to be selected if necessary. So we're going to consider some aspects of the targeting of risk within your sample strategy. Now, as a minimum threshold, we would like you to sample 5 portfolios per run. This will apply obviously to cohorts of greater than 5, obviously, but minimum of 5 per run is that minimum threshold we want. This will also translate into a 10%, minimum of a 10% of the cohort. So if we're going beyond 50 within a run, we should be looking to increase that. So 5, for most centres, for most courses, 5 portfolios will be where you're at for selection. Now, within that 5, we want the selection to be structured. For many centres and historically, sampling has been done on a random basis. Therefore, portfolios have been selected without any due consideration to any content or outcomes. So what we want you to do, rather than do that, so make your sample to reflect the range of performance within the run, the range of portfolio qualities. This should include any failures. We should be selecting a sample of 1 failure, if there are more than 1 failure within the run, 1 failure. We should also be selecting borderline passes and good passes in order to demonstrate that range of quality. Now, borderline cases are a key risk factor within the process. Within a pass-fail assessment process, the borderline portfolio present the greatest risk. We're not looking at a percentage score. Either the learner has passed or they failed. Therefore, where that line, that pass-fail line lies, is of vital importance in terms of quality. If that line is falling in an appropriate place, we end up with learners that have failed which should have passed. We have learners that have passed which should have failed. This has a potential to greatly undermine the whole assessment process. Sampling of borderline cases, therefore, is essential to the appropriate awarding of credit and therefore overall assessment quality. As well as borderline cases, we need to ensure that any reasonable adjustments or special considerations are included within your sample strategy. This is explicitly stated. Now, in the delivery of or implementation of reasonable adjustments, there is going to be risk. Risk is going to be a factor which we can't avoid in their application. So they must be addressed within sampling. If you have made any reasonable adjustments or special considerations within your run, these should automatically be included in your sample. Now, if you have made permission required reasonable adjustments for all of your learners, we cannot redefine our assessment strategy within the context of the reasonable adjustment. And in these instances, you are going to need to always select 100% of your portfolios. There's an exception to the rule, and if that sounds confusing, I refer you to the literature supporting reasonable adjustment and special consideration implementation. If you have a case in which all your learners have reasonable adjustment, you ought to redefine your assessment strategy in accordance with the reasonable adjustment being made. That makes sense. If they're permission required adjustments, you can't do that. So in the event that you have all your learners in this bracket, you will need to select 100% of your portfolios. Okay, if a course is being delivered for the first time, a course of qualification delivered for the first time, then we would expect that sampling for that run to be 100%. If there's any risk or any issues manifesting within your new course of qualification, then they will appear at the start. We expect them to appear from the very start. So that makes sense for us to select them all the portfolios to start with, to identify such issues that may arise. So 100% selection for a new course. We also want to consider a similar application for a new assessor. If you've, no matter how experienced that assessor is, if that assessor is operating within your centre for the first time, then we would expect you to select 100% of the portfolios from that initial run. Also, if there are any questions raised over the prior performance of an assessor through a previous internal verification process or another quality review process, then the threshold for selection should be increased as appropriate to 100% or otherwise. There may also be other identified issues that have been raised by internal verification or through an external verification process conducted by OCN. If that is the case, then we would expect these also to feed into your sampling procedures as specific identified risks for sampling to support the sampling of portfolios. That may not be necessarily translate into a consistent sampling procedural point, but certainly should be considered. In terms of the structural considerations for your sampling strategy, first of all, we'll want to look at the variation in assessment methods and evidence. Now, if your assessment methods and evidence within a run are not uniform, in other words, there may be various methods of assessment taking place within a run, or a variety of different evidences within that one run being produced by learners, then sampling must reflect the range of variation within that. You ought to select from each type of evidence or from each evidence produced by each assessment method. Now, this may necessitate an increase in the numbers of portfolios being sampled, but we want you to do this to ensure the consistency across delivery. This would be an unusual circumstance, but it's possible that it could take place. It could be what you do within your centre. So we need to ensure that the different types of assessment or methods of assessment or evidence that are being conducted within one run within your centre are duly considered. If there are variations in modes of assessment, such as part-time or full-time learners or online learning, or if there are other defined group divisions within a cohort, then sampling must reflect this with suitable selections from each type. Again, this could necessitate an increase in your sampling thresholds. If there are variations in sites for training and assessment, then sampling must reflect this with suitable selections from each location or each type. So structural processes present in themselves a risk, and we need you to structure your sampling process in accordance with that to ensure that risk is addressed. So in terms of what we want you to avoid within your sampling strategy, random selection. Please do not apply random selection in sampling. We don't want you to have a consistent 100% selection either, unless otherwise justified. This is unnecessary. This undermines the purpose of sampling. Of course, there are instances where we want you to sample 100%, but generally speaking, these are exceptions rather than the rule. Another often used procedure in internal verification is applying the square root of the number of candidates as a threshold. Please avoid this too. We're looking for a minimum of 5. That would, under the square root process, of course, this would mean that you'd need to have more than 25 learners per run. That isn't often or necessarily going to be the case. Finally, I would like us to consider what a good point for good practice within sampling. We're going to have a sampling procedure, a written document outlining our IV sampling process, a point for good practice which some centres are operating, and which I would encourage you to apply likewise, is to record the justifications for your sampling decisions in order to demonstrate compliance with written procedures. So in summing up, sampling procedures are of vital and central importance to your overall quality systems, and having written procedures that are in accordance with the points laid out within this presentation are of prime importance to ensure that process works. So we encourage you to get your written procedures in order, get them distributed within your centre and applied. Thank you very much indeed.